Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the award-winning Texas history podcast. I'm your host, Ken Wise. Thanks for tuning in today for some Texas history. I'm releasing this podcast on March 2nd, 2021. That is the 185th anniversary of Texas independence, so happy Independence Day to everybody. I've got a very special episode for you on this Texas Independence Day. If you're listening to this podcast, you likely agree with me that Texas history is not just important, but it's also exciting, it's unique, frankly, it's fun. The stories of Texas history are also just great stories. You know, the old saying, the truth is stranger than fiction. Well, nowhere is that more correct than in Texas history. But since the actual history of Texas has so many great characters and plot lines, if you use Texas history as a basis for historical fiction, it gets even better. But writers have to be careful. If you start messing with the true stories of Texas history, you are most certainly going to hear about it. But if you're skilled enough to let the history drive a great story, you end up with some absolutely wonderful works. And there have been some spectacular historical fiction centered around Texas history, and of course there have been some big misses too. So what would you look for if you were to pick a writer to engage in a quest to write historical fiction around Texas history? Well, how about somebody that can not only write great history, but they can also write great fiction? Well, we're lucky. Texas has great writers, and one of its best is James L. Haley. Jim Haley grew up in Fort Worth. He graduated from the University of Texas at Arlington, and he spent some time at UT Law School in Austin. But lucky for us, he decided to pursue writing instead of law. Now, he's written, I want to say 20 books, and I hope that number's correct. He's won multiple awards. He's won the prestigious Spur Award from the Western Writers of America, which he won twice. He's also won the T.R. Fehrenbach Book Award from the Texas Historical Commission, also has won that twice. He's written biographies, a biography of Jack London, a great biography of Sam Houston, considered by many the best, a history of the Texas Supreme Court. He wrote a book called Captive Paradise, which is a history of Hawaii. He wrote a wonderful narrative history of Texas called Passionate Nation, and has written, along with Marilyn Duncan, a book series called Taming Texas, which provides a history of the Texas legal system for 7th grade Texas history students. So he's done it all. Well, his current project is a series of naval adventure novels featuring a sailor named Bliven Putnam, the main character. And the 4th book in this series is being released today, Texas Independence Day. And the title is Captain Putnam for the Republic of Texas. So I reached out to try and convince Mr. Haley to come on Wise About Texas and talk about his writing process, his research process, the difference between writing history and historical fiction, since he's done both very well. And of course, the role of the Texas Navy in the Texas Revolution, and many other things. So today I'm going to present an interview with one of Texas's finest writers, James L. Haley. Enjoy. Jim, thanks so much for being on Wise About Texas today.
It's great to be with you.
Well, it's an honor for me. We're recording this podcast in early 2021. I want to ask you first, as a writer, how has all of the lockdowns in connection with the pandemic, how's that treating you? Are you more productive, less productive? What have you been up to?
It was not what I expected. I live alone. I work alone. You'd think I wouldn't care. But I forgot. I go out for breakfast 3 times a week just to talk to the damn waiters. And it has been murder. It has been absolute murder. And then every time I start to get depressed, there's somebody posted a meme on the internet that said Shakespeare's Globe Theater was closed down for plague, and they couldn't have plays. So he used that time to write King Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, and something else.
Oh my gosh.
I better get busy.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. I'm not sure I would have wanted to know that. Well, it's a particular honor for me to have you on the Wise About Texas podcast. You don't know this. Now, for our listeners, we've known each other for several years, but you don't even know this story. You're one of the inspirations for the beginning of this podcast. Now, I'm not going to make this all about me, but I'm going to make it about me for a minute.
You might recall my very first Supreme Court Historical Society trustees meeting. You were present, I believe, as a trustee, and Bill Brands was our guest speaker.
Oh, I was there. I'll do anything to listen to Bill Brands.
Oh, yeah, he's great. And I was standing there with you and Bill Brands. So I've both met you both for the first time, two of my historical literary heroes. And I've only been starstruck one other time, and that was when I met Waylon Jennings. So I'm standing there trying to make small talk with these two renowned authors. And it was Brands that did this to me. He looked at me and he goes, "What are you working on?" And then you looked at me. And I knew the question meant, what historical project were you working on? I had nothing. I had no answer, nothing. And that's when I started looking for something to do to give a little bit back to the history community. And that's what started Wise About Texas.
Oh,
so
wow.
Thank you for that inspiration.
I'm delighted to know that. That goes into my memoirs.
So like Shakespeare to you during this lockdown, it's Haley to Wise on Wise About Texas. So I appreciate that.
Like my life has suddenly been made worthwhile because your episodes are just marvelous.
Oh, well, thanks for saying that. Thanks for saying that. No money has changed hands for that comment. All right. Well, I'm honored to have you on the podcast, but I'm especially glad to interview you today. I'm going to release this podcast right around the release of your latest book. Now, you're a very prolific author, and I'd love to talk about all your books, but I want to talk about the one that's just now coming out because it is a work of historical fiction. You are an excellent fiction writer and an excellent history writer, but you have combined the two in your latest, Captain Putnam for the Republic of Texas. Now, if I'm right, this is the fourth book in the Bliven Putnam series. So tell us about that series.
Well, Bliven Putnam, that's actually quite a great story. There was a legendary editor at Putnam, Nita Talblib. She edited Danielle Steele. She edited Dean Koontz. And my agent, Jim Hornfisher, was in New York running his trot line, and he had a meeting with Nita. Well, what are you working on? Is there anything I can put before you in the next year? And she said, well, those wonderful naval tall ship series like Horatio Hornblower and the Master and Commander series, we'd love to do one of those, but they're all British and they're all Napoleonic. We would really love to do an American series, but we're holding off because we don't know that the American Navy was really doing anything between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. And my agent said, hold the phone, I might have somebody. And I got home from work that day and there was an email saying, call me Opportunity Knocks.
So, always a good message.
Yeah. And we talked about it. Well, opportunity doesn't knock very often. So I grabbed him by the belt and yanked him inside. Good. And 2 days later, I sent them a bullet point outline for an interlocking series, buddy stories, two guys who bond during the Barbary Pirate War as 14-year-old midshipmen. And then the second book was about the War of 1812. The third book was among the missionaries in Hawaii in 1820. And now the fourth one is about the Texas Revolution, which has really been great because the other series, the Hornblower series and the Master and Commander series, were never intended to be series. It's sold just enough, so maybe we'll try another one. And so they're a mess of prequels and sequels. But I get to age my characters through each book, and it's just been more fun than a barrel of monkeys.
Well, you don't have to answer this, but did you plan out the series when you finally got the deal to do it? Did you say, okay, here are the major events into which I'm going to put Captain Putnam?
Well, that really segues us into the art of fiction as opposed to doing history.
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about. But so let's go for it.
Fiction is about 8 times harder than plain old history because you have to know the whole life. And so one reason I made my characters from Litchfield, Connecticut. Today, Litchfield is like the number 208 largest city in Connecticut. But in 1800, it was the 4th largest. It was the financial, intellectual, educational, cultural capital of Connecticut. Lyman Beecher, the great abolitionist, moved his whole operation there in 1810, I think mostly for the fundraising. But he's a major character in these early stories. So it was the scene of the greatest girls' finishing school, Mrs. Pierce's School for Girls, in the entire country was in Litchfield. And Clarity, who winds up becoming Mrs. Putnam, is a product of that. You may know this. It was also the site of the first law school in the United States. Yeah, Mr. Justice Reeve of the Connecticut Supreme Court realized that, well, rather than let somebody come into your office and, as they used to say, read for the law,
read the law, right?
Classes, and then I can turn out lawyers like ginger cookies. Which
and the rest is history.
Really. So the more you know about the culture, the better book you can write as a novelist, because none of that would figure into a straight history of the Barbary War.
So were you chomping at the bit to write about the Texas Revolution during Captain Putnam's life? Or?
Oh, you have no idea. You have no idea. Because I had to, the number 2 character, Sam Bandy, who's the best friend, I had earlier on, he had to go broke in South Carolina, which was easy enough during the Panic of 1819, so that he could come to Texas with Stephen F. Austin. So by the time of book 4, those 15 years have passed. And I've been so looking forward to doing this. And it was shocking how fast the thing. Now, here's one thing about historical fiction. You just have to learn to trust yourself. It's sort of like when Winston Churchill was learning to paint, and he set up his canvas on the seashore, and he took a little bitty brush and he dipped it in the blue, and he's a little bit of blue in there. And an artist friend of his said, no, that's not how you. So he took a big old brush and just started schlepping blue all over the top of the canvas. Well, that's, if you're going to write, you just have to trust your education and your craft. And if you're an artist, art happens. If you're not an artist, a mess happens. And that is the terror that I live with.
Yes. Now all of a sudden I'm nervous about the next legal opinion I write. So,
yeah.
But your first book was not fiction. Your first book was history, was it not?
About the Barbary War? No,
I'm going back over the course of your career out of the
series. Yeah. Oh, dear me. Yeah.
As a writer.
Yeah, the Buffalo War, it came out, oh dear. Believe it or not, it came out in 1976.
Way back when.
And it was a history of the last of the Comanche Indian Wars. And you've done your job when it's still in print 45 years later.
Yeah, that's quite the compliment. And you wrote one of the books that I get asked to recommend books is to non-history buffs about Texas history, and Passionate Nation, one of your works, is one that is always on that list.
Oh, bless your heart.
Which was a more of a narrative history. Can you talk about that aspect of your historical writing?
Well, that was very interesting. Bruce Nichols, who the last I heard, he had become the president and publisher at Macmillan. He was an editor at Free Press, division of Simon & Schuster, and recruited the book. They called me about it, and he said, now, there's lots of Texas history out there. We don't want you to go reinvent the wheel and do original sources and all that. We just want Texas history with your edge and your humor in it. And as a way of introducing himself to me, he sent me a copy of a book called Lost Prophet. It's a biography of Bayard Rustin from the Civil Rights Movement, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. And I thought, the hell you say, I'd better go back and reinvent the wheel. I'm not going to be the weak link on your list. So my job, it was sort of a Rubik's Cube. I had to, 1, tell all the relevant history, 2, be witty and often funny, 3, have something new in every chapter that people, I didn't know that, and 4, hold it to under 500 pages. Well, like a Rubik's Cube, something had to go.
Right. Let me guess, because I know it's longer than 500 pages.
Yeah. And so I think it's like a little over 600 pages, which when my good friend Steve Harrigan just did his big wonderful thing, he got to write in the Ted Fehrenbach Lone Star mold. I think he got 900, 1,000 pages, something like that.
He got between 900 and 1,000. The listeners have heard him interviewed on this podcast, but I don't talk about that particular big, wonderful thing in terms of pages. I talk about it in terms of pounds. It comes in over 5 pounds. So
his is a journalistic history. He asked questions that a journalist would write. And we were sort in desultory correspondence while he was working on it. And I kept saying, look, every writer that comes along has their own questions to ask. When it comes out, don't worry about me. I'm going to be first in line to buy it. You're not, I'm not a wolf. I did not pee on this territory.
Well, let me, speaking of that, and maybe not in exactly the same words, but what do you consider yourself? A historian, a writer of history, a novelist? What are you?
Well,
label yourself for us.
I just think of myself as a writer. You got a job, I'll try and do it. Some of the writers that I most admire, like Peter Matthiessen, have been double threats. They do novels and they do history. In fact, when I began research on the Putnam Navy stories and learning everything I could about the early Navy, probably to this good day, the best book ever written about the first 50 years of the United States Navy was written by, are you ready?
I'm ready.
James Fenimore, Last of the Mohicans Cooper.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, he worked in a Navy office for decades. But his history of the Navy is still just the best, even though he was really a novelist. So shorter answer, I just think of myself as a writer.
Okay, so when you're doing historical fiction then, so you've written the history, you've written fiction, not always historical fiction, probably more often than not historical fiction, but you go from what is probably the number one biography of Sam Houston and all of the rigor of primary sources and citations and all of that sort of thing, to the novel where it's all whatever, anything goes. How do you do your research? What do you find yourself going more toward the history or more toward the fiction, or how does that work in the writer's mind?
Well, every time I get stuck creatively about what to do in a story, if I would ever grow up and learn to trust the history, that the history will tell me what to do. I've been stuck in the past. I wrote a novel many years ago about the Tsavo man-eating lions in Kenya in 1898. And I worked on it, I sent it in. And my agent said, nah, it's a great story, but there's no sex. Well, I always heard that happened. And right. I didn't really know what to do because I was a church kid. So I went back and I read the memoirs of the Governor General of Kenya Colony at that time. And I read cultural stuff about the natives. Well, it turned out that the Wakamba tribe had this thing called the Kinyola, which was a protection racket. Whenever there was a plague or locusts or man-eating lions, the witch doctor would go from household to household until he found some single woman, young, poor, nobody cared about her. Well, he would finger her as the witch, and she would wake up one morning and she'd be the only one in the village. And so she'd do her chores until one of the Morani, the warriors, would sneak up behind her and run her through with a lance.
Oh,
well,
goodness.
Occasionally, one of these women would wake up and be the only one in the village and say, phooey on this, and run like hell. Well, when the British were there, the best thing she could do was join a camp of British railroad coolies, because it would be easier for her to join another Wakamba group if she was pregnant. Like buying a cow with a calf. So she would service railroad coolies. Well, all that gave me not just a context for sex, but it made the story deeper.
Right.
And really, really improved it. So when I get stuck creatively, I just look deeper and deeper into the history. It's funny, one mistake that a lot of beginning writers in historical fiction do, they read about the time and the people and all that. That's not enough. You have to read stuff from the time.
Right.
To get how they used language, what their social expectations were. When I was working on the Putnam books, book tour, I'm on a train, I'm going through the entire width of Connecticut, beautiful, deep, dark forest. And I thought, I've got to do something with these beautiful, Robert Frost type woods. And so I got really into it. Well, then I found out that Timothy Dwight, early president of Yale College, not yet university, wrote a 4-volume travelogue about New England that I could walk into PCL library at UT. They had them on the shelf and I could just find the one with Connecticut and check it out. It was published in 1818, which shocks me that you can still get your hands on it. Well, it turned out that at that time, the biggest worry and greatest expense that people had during the winter was firewood, because they had cut all the trees for farms. And so how are you going to keep warm in the winter was a big problem. And all that forest that I saw was second growth. And third growth. So I very nearly put my foot in it and made a big historical mistake. Oh, and believe me, the readers out there, when you make a mistake, they
catch you.
Oh boy, yeah, they got you.
Yeah, I don't get away with anything on this podcast that I don't hear about.
Great.
So you mentioned something about the dialect, and that was actually something I noted. There was a great phrase in your book, and I believe Sam Houston says it, and he says, "That is how we shall have it," which I just love that phrase. So tell us about the language research and trying to capture the language of 1820s and 30s Texas.
Oh, 1820s and 30s Texas. There are so many memoirs from that era. There's not a lot of publishing done at that time. But one thing I'm sure you've noticed is that the early numbers of the Southwestern Historical Quarterly from the 1890s are mostly memoirs of people from back then.
Yes, very interesting.
I got very lucky once. I curated an exhibit for the State Capitol's Visitor Center many years ago, about 150 years since statehood. And so I'm curating this exhibit. Oh my goodness, the toys they let us have for 6 months. We got the only Lone Star flag known to have flown over the Republic.
Wow.
We got the pen that President Polk signed us into the Union with. We got Santa Ana Spurs captured at San Jacinto. Oh my goodness, the toys that we got. Well, I went over to what was then the Barker Texas History Center. It's now the Center for American History. And they have the largest existing collection of Texas newspapers, but they want you to use it on microfilm because those things are fragile.
Right.
And so I talked to the guy and I said, look, if I was looking for one article about one thing, okay, I'll use microfilm, but I'm doing a whole wall of pullouts from the newspapers of that era. And I really, really need like double extra secret permission to look at those newspapers so I can just scan what all they have. Well, they let me do it.
Oh, wow.
And so I had like a 20-foot wall in the visitor center with sort of faded picture backgrounds of newspaper sheets and then pullouts in maybe 24-point type of the stories. And newspapers back then weren't just news. They were inspiration. They were poetry. They were fiction. It was like the only reading material people had. Right. So the newspapers from early Texas were full of those early expressions, like uses of grammar, phrases, what people thought was funny that it wouldn't register as funny today,
right?
Because we don't know what they're talking about. So early newspapers are a big source of that for Texas because there's not many books that were published then.
Well, I always get distracted when researching a specific subject in those old newspapers. I'll always start reading around it.
Oh, no kidding.
It takes me. Oh, yeah. I mean, I read the ads. I read the ads, especially in the old Texas Telegraph about Houston of whose store had what just arrived from New Orleans and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And, they didn't have a lot of places, stores that you could walk in and buy stuff.
Just be on the street.
The riverboat captains would post notices up the streams that they're bringing their little riverboat up the Brazos, and if you have anything to trade, bring your corn and your hides down to the bank. And I've got nails and shoes and lumber, and they would say all the stuff that they had to trade. So that gives you a sense, that Texas was a very bump and rumble sort of economy. There was very
much.
To change hands.
Yeah, that's really neat. Well, you had a lot of knowledge of Sam Houston, for example, who figures prominently in this novel. And I don't want you to give away everything in the book, but there's a great interplay because Captain Putnam, of course, is a United States naval officer.
Right.
We have President Jackson making an appearance, and the third leg of that stool being Sam Houston. So talk a little bit. Was there a little bit of Haley's theory of what might have happened during the Texas Revolution and the U.S.'s involvement, or is it your wish list, or Tell us how you got to where you got to.
Oh, dear me. Okay, I won't give away the book, but I'll give away a little trade secret.
Okay.
I was in Huntsville last March to give the Independence Day speech over General Houston's grave. That is like the greatest honor that Huntsville can give you, right? So the night before, I went to dinner at the home of McKinley and Woodward, he's the director of the Sam Houston Memorial Museum. And among this group at dinner were two of Sam Houston's nephews, like great nephews. And during dinner conversation, one of them, we were talking about Houston's delaying tactics. He's not going to fight Santa Anna head on.
Right.
In fact, Houston later, and of course, there's 8 volumes of his published writings and that many more unpublished. You can't know everything. Even I can't know everything. But this fellow said Houston later described his strategy as Fabian. I thought, well, okay. So I get back to my motel, I get on the internet and I start researching this like crazy because I've got to give the speech in the morning about Houston's retreat. And come to find, Houston, of course, he was a deep student of history and especially ancient history. And he had studied Quintus Fabius Maximus and his retreat from Hannibal in 216 BC, when Fabius would not fight him head on, stretch his supply lines, harry his flanks, wait for an opportunity. Well, at that time, the Roman Senate was full of people who were calling him a coward. You've got to fight now. Replaced him with somebody else who went out, fought Hannibal head on, and was obliterated. The Roman army was just destroyed. So they put Quintus Fabius back in command. Okay, you had it right. And he knew that he could not afford to let the government know what he was doing, or they would replace him. It was around second week of April when he opened that letter from President Burnett saying, "Sir, the enemy are laughing you to scorn. You must fight," blah, blah, blah. That's why he kept his own counsel. And talk about an early expression. He said, if I had let people know what I was doing, I would have been like the mule between 2 stacks of hay. And not that was the term. So yeah, I learned things from the family the night before that speech. That's a very long answer, but
no,
that was one of my keys to Houston, was what I learned from the family, that I instantly altered the story to put that in there.
Well, that's fascinating. One thing, how did you do your naval research for this series? Because it really, when you read these books, you really feel like you probably could join the crew at any time. How did that come about?
I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 shelves here of early naval history about the U.S. Navy and the commanders and all that, shipbuilding. And I tell you what, it's really lucky that it was for the 3rd book that I got to go to Boston and give a talk to the Naval Order of the United States. And the hotel was in the Charlestown Navy Yard. And we got a guided tour of the frigate Constitution the next day.
Oh my gosh, that would have been
And
great.
I made such a fool of myself because, the hatch in the wardroom down to the magazine was right where it was on the blueprints. And I got so excited. And I was looking down in there as far as I could, because that's the oldest surviving part of the ship, is the powder handling room in the magazine. And I asked the captain, she's still in commission. She's the oldest warship in the world still in commission.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The older ones like the Victory, but they're, they don't go out anymore. And I said, I thought about writing ahead and see if I could get like double extra secret permission to wiggle down there, because it would help me to see, that crawl space into the magazine and so on and so on. And he said, well, come back. We'll make it happen. But I am so glad that I did not actually see the details on that ship until after I wrote those first 2 books. Because if I had the emotional connection, there's so much to see and understand, I couldn't have written about anything else. And they would not have been novels. It would have been, and the poor docent who was showing us around, Seaman Gonzalez. I'm with a bunch of retired admirals and so on, and commodores, and they're sitting there with their legs on their cap. And he was so intimidated. I gave him a couple of softball questions. Oh, he even let us go down into the orlop which is the lowest part of the ship, and it's not on the tourist areas. But we let him take it. He took us down there. And I said, wow, does this mean you're going to let us go up into the fighting tops? And he was like, no. Because we would need safety lines for that. And I don't have safety lines, but it was just great. And well, for the Barbary War book, online, there's, I think, 4,000 pages of Navy papers about the Barbary War that you can download. And then the trick is to keep writing a story and make sure you write a story and not start quoting documents. You can't let your historian take over, because when you write a novel, it's everything has to serve the story. Every word has to serve the story.
Well, are you willing to tell us a couple of things that served the story of Captain Putnam in the Texas Revolution? I thought I might have recognized some places and events, but I'd like to see what you will let us know about that.
Oh boy. Well, he didn't like Andrew Jackson. That's a political aspect that we forget, is that New Englanders really had no use for Andrew Jackson. They were horrified by what he did with and to the presidency. His big inaugural party where they trashed the place and they were breaking windows, and all this kind of stuff. So when the story opens in Florida in 1834 at the Seminole War, which there's a reason for that, because the fellow who was sent down by Jackson to deal with the Seminoles was well known to Sam Houston because they had been in Congress together. So when Bliven comes to Texas and he has his interview with General Houston and sort of badmouths this guy in Florida about, what an idiot he was with the Indians, Houston lets him know, I like that man. We were in Congress together. Of course, it's true. He's kind of an idiot. So yeah, there was one of those cases where if I get stuck with a story, I go deeper into the history, and the history every time has helped me out and gotten me through a lump in the story.
Well, what's your estimation of the importance of the Navy in the Texas Revolution? Captain Putnam in this novel is sent to assist the Texas Navy. Talk a little bit about the naval operations in the Texas Revolution.
Well, now that is actually very interesting, because when you think about naval battles, you think about ships of the line, trading thundering broadsides across deep water. And, a frigate, the Constitution had 44 guns, but she was really pierced for 60. A ship of the line, a first-rated ship of the line might have 100 guns. In the Gulf, the two biggest Mexican cruisers in the Gulf had 3 or 4. So these were not hornblower-esque naval battles in the Gulf. Right. So, but the irony is that so much depended on the Texas Navy. I mean, in fact, the teaser at the very beginning of the book is a quote from Sam Houston saying we must, look to the Navy for essential aid, for keeping the routes open and so on. So it was a different kind of naval warfare. It was as fraught and as danger and deadly, if you're there, as any other naval battle. There just weren't as many guns involved. Plus, there was politics. Commodore Moore of the Texas Navy was constantly scheming. In fact, a lot of the officers were would-be politicians. So it was, that plays in it too, because they're having to dodge around President Burnett, who, one of the aides that he sent to Sam Houston was really a spy to let him know what Houston is doing. In fact, when they couldn't catch him drinking, they made up a story about his using opium, which wasn't true. That was Hazard Perry. Well, what Burnett didn't know was that Houston also had a spy in the government who was the Secretary of State, Sam Price Carson, who was letting him know. I mean, it was the cluster F you ever saw trying to fight a revolution, because everybody hated each other, kind of like the American Revolution.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, tell us, let me ask you this finally. What did Captain Putnam learn from his participation in the Texas Revolution, and what's What's next for Captain Putnam, if you can tell us?
What he learned is that he's really kind of tired because in book one, he's 14 years old. Now, in book one, I made them 14 to be believable. Midshipmen were often 11 or 12.
Wow.
But nobody would believe that now. So that's one concession I made. Then there are lieutenants in the second book, of captain in the third book, and he's still a captain in the fourth book. But now he's getting close to 50. And clarity has been waiting at home for him all these years. There's a reason why I put him on a farm with an apple orchard in Connecticut, which is in real life, General Israel Putnam's occupation. It was Israel Putnam who brought the very first Vermont russet apples into Connecticut, and that the Putnam family actually did really grow apples and press cider. That was one of the things they did for income. So he really wants to go home, and when he wins Jackson's approbation, he winds up being in Washington when Santa Anna. Excuse me. After San Jacinto, he is sent to Washington to deal with Jackson, which that was one of the most fun scenes to compose I've ever
I bet
ever come across. In fact, here's a little hint for writers. When I was working on my first novel, and I had no idea what I was doing, it was a Western. It was a genre Western for Doubleday. The great David Lindsay, who did the Stu Hayden mysteries for Doubleday and Athenaeum, we went to the same church. And he thought I was great stuff because I was doing nonfiction, and I thought he was great stuff because he was writing these novels, making a lot more money than I was. And I said, David, and after church, I went, David, wait, stop. I'm stuck. Help me. How do you write a novel? And he looked at me and said, well, Jim, I don't write my novels. I let my characters write my novel for me. Great, thanks a lot.
Yeah, a lot of help that is.
Yeah, a lot of help. And he said, no, really, try it. Know your characters, know the situation, but take yourself off the page and just channel what they were do, just stream of consciousness. It's ancient thinking that all the stories are already written. You've just got to tap into them and let them come through you. Try it. And so I was working on this Western, and I got home, and I thought, okay, all right, just get into this. And I got up like 15 pages later. It was the best 15 pages I'd ever written. That was the best advice I ever got, was to not write. And there's all kinds of ways to write a novel. You can be Age of Innocence, and you can spend pages on a person, every thought, every motivation, every feeling they have, or you can just let the characters carry it for you, which is more of the way Jack London would have written it at the same time. And if I find that it works best for me to let the characters do it. Now, in closing, let me say that there's all kinds of ways to write historical fiction. I mean, you can tell your story and put them in costume. That gets you to Braveheart. Right. Interesting story, nothing in there actually happened, or it didn't happen that way, or there's lots of cool stuff that did happen that's not in there. Right. At the other extreme, you can research the history and invent some dialogue, which isn't very interesting. But there's anything in between there is fair game to do it. And I tend to let the characters do it for me.
Well, I can say I was privileged to be able to read an advanced copy of this book. And as a more history-oriented person, I found it very insightful in the Texas Revolution, because whether you're, the way the characters wrote the novel for you, as you say, I think provided insight into events that people will recognize when they read the book, even though it's fiction.
Bless you, Ken. Yeah, I
thought it was wonderful.
Well, I appreciate that so much, because that's why you do a story, is that you're allowed to comment in such a way. Can I turn tables here? Can I ask you something?
Sure.
Were you put off at all by the relationship between Sam and Dicey? I've been warned that I will get blowback about that.
I was not. I thought that was authentic. That happened lots and lots of times.
Okay, because it's
in the
not
Republic.
Correct.
Well,
say that now.
Right. I thought it was just another aspect of early Texas. People want to disregard history that they don't like, or they don't feel, for whatever reason, they don't like it. Yeah. They think it immoral or not politically correct or whatever it is. And they just ignore it.
Whether to do that or not. But you and I know from Texas history, Justice Hemphill and his relationship with Sabina. And he wound up putting his daughters through Wilberforce University in Ohio. And we forget Wilberforce University was founded for the purpose of giving an education to mixed race children of Southern planters. That's a big part of the history that we just don't like to talk about. So without giving any more of the story away, I'm glad you weren't offended by that.
No, not at all. And I think, like I said, I think it's an authentic part. That's authentic history. And it made a difference. And it just shows, or should show, the reader how complicated history is. It doesn't fit into the boxes we want to put it in.
Yeah, and as sort of presaged by slaves in earlier books, Dicey had her agency. She was making her own decision.
Right, absolutely.
She would have been mortally offended to call her a victim of anything.
Exactly. Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining Wise About Texas today. Captain Putnam for the Republic of Texas is now out wherever books are sold. I certainly enjoyed it, and I know the listeners will too. And just thank you so much for playing a role in starting this podcast. And finally, 5 years later, I was able to interview you. So thank you so much.
Ken, when we're all vaccinated and you're down in Austin, lunch is on me.
Oh, that's a deal, and that's now recorded for posterity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Jim Haley. You can find our Facebook page, Wise About Texas. Find us on Twitter and Instagram at Wise About Texas. If you get a minute, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. That helps other Texas history buffs find the show. And if you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. Thanks again for tuning in today, and go out and do something for Texas today. Happy Independence Day. Until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.